They laughed because they got everything to house the money, and I only got an old lighthouse. Soon, this lighthouse brought me millions. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. My name is Tim Crow. I'm 38 years old, and I am officially the guy who face-planted the American dream so hard, I left a crater. By 2025, I'd managed to lose my marketing job because some AI algorithm decided it could write better copy than me. Thanks, technology. My girlfriend Sarah packed her bags and told me I was stuck in the 90s like some kind of nostalgic fossil. And just to complete the trifecta of failure, my own brother Kevin kicked me out of our family landscaping business because apparently I didn't pull my weight. Kevin always was a golden child anyway. When Grandpa passed away last October, I figured maybe, just maybe, the universe owed me one small break. You know how it is when you're at rock bottom and you start looking for signs that things might turn around. I wasn't expecting millions or anything crazy, but maybe enough to get back on my feet. A little nest egg, some old stocks. Hell, I would have been happy with his vintage Chevy pickup. Instead, I inherited a lighthouse. Not just any lighthouse. Mind you, this was a 147-year-old stone tower perched on Black Point, Maine, looking like something out of a Stephen King novel. The kind of place where you half expect to see ghost ships rolling in with the fog. Grandpa had bought it back in the 80s through some veteran assistance program for practically nothing because nobody else wanted the headache. The family reunion after the funeral was like watching a comedy roast where I was the main course. Uncle Jerry nearly choked on his Budweiser laughing. Cousin Mike kept slapping his knee asking what I was going to do, catch ghosts for a living. Even my mom, bless her heart, couldn't hide that look of pity mixed with secondhand embarrassment. The thing was falling apart worse than my credit score. The roof leaked like a broken promise. There was no Wi-Fi for miles, and I swear the seagulls had it out for the place personally. Every morning they'd circle around like little feathered vandals, leaving their calling cards all over the walkway. But here's where it gets interesting. See, I remembered something nobody else did. When I was maybe 8 or 9, Grandpa used to take me out to that lighthouse on summer weekends. Back then it felt like our secret hideout, just the two of us against the world. He'd pack peanut butter sandwiches and thermos of coffee that he'd let me sip even though Mom would have had a fit. We'd sit on those weathered rocks watching the waves crash, and he'd tell me stories about the old days. Not the boring history book stuff, but real stories about smugglers and storms and ships that disappeared in the night. His favorite thing to say was this: "Tim, real treasures hide where nobody thinks to look." I used to think he was just being philosophical, you know? Like when old folks tell you that family is the real treasure or some Hallmark card wisdom. But there was something in his eyes when he said it, like he knew something the rest of the U.S. didn't. So when everyone was laughing about my lighthouse inheritance, I made a decision that probably seemed as smart as trying to swim upstream. I packed my beat-up Honda Civic with what was left of my belongings and drove 6 hours north to Maine. Not because I believed in childhood fairy tales, but because I literally had nowhere else to go. My apartment lease was up, my couch surfing options were exhausted, and my bank account had about enough left for 2 weeks at a motel. The lighthouse was mine, free and clear, even if it was basically a tall stone tent with a view. The drive up Route 1 gave me plenty of time to think about how my life had gone sideways. Somewhere between Boston and Portland, it hit me that maybe this was exactly what John Lennon meant when he talked about life being what happens while you're making other plans. Except in my case, life was handing me a lighthouse when I couldn't even swim properly. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, inheriting a structure designed to guide people safely to shore, and I was the one who needed rescuing. When I finally pulled up to Black Point, the November wind was howling like it had a personal grudge against anyone dumb enough to be out there. The lighthouse stood silhouetted against those gray Maine clouds, looking exactly like every haunted house movie you've ever seen. For a second, I just sat in my car wondering if this was rock bottom or if there were still a few more levels to go. The key was exactly where Grandpa's lawyer said it would be, under the third loose stone on the eastern wall. Walking into that place was like stepping back in time. Everything smelled like salt air, old wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe memories. The main floor was basically one big round room with a tiny kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. There was a wood-burning stove that probably violated about 12 modern safety codes, and furniture that looked like it came from a yard sale in 1975. The spiral staircase leading up to the lamp room creaked like it was auditioning for a horror movie soundtrack. But you know what? It was mine. For the first time in months, I was standing in a place that belonged to me, where nobody could tell me I wasn't good enough or that I needed to get my act together. I spent the first week just trying to make the place livable. The generator worked about half the time. There was a family of raccoons that had apparently been using the storage room as their personal vacation home. And I discovered that lighthouse maintenance was not covered in any YouTube tutorials. The isolation was intense. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and cell service was about as reliable as a politician's promise. But there was something peaceful about it, too. After months of job interviews and relationship drama and family disappointment, the silence was almost therapeutic. It was during my second week, while I was going through Grandpa's old things, that everything changed. I'd been putting off dealing with his personal belongings because, honestly, it felt too heavy. But the temperature was dropping fast, and I needed every piece of furniture and blanket I could find. In the bedroom, there was this old mahogany dresser that looked like it had survived both world wars. The bottom drawer was stuck worse than a politician, avoiding a direct question. When I finally got open, I found the usual old man collection. Suspenders, reading glasses, a pocket watch that hadn't worked since the Reagan era. But underneath all that everyday stuff, wrapped in what looked like an old pillowcase, was a leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and when I opened it, I could smell that distinctive old paper scent mixed with something that might have been pipe tobacco. The first page was in Grandpa's careful handwriting. Property of Samuel Crow, Black Point Light Station, 1944 to 1985. My heart started doing this weird, fluttering thing as I flipped through the pages. This wasn't just any old diary. These were detailed entries about the lighthouse, about ships he'd spotted, about storms and rescues and things that happened during the war years when he was just a teenager. But it was page 47 that made me sit down hard on the bedroom floor. There, in pencil that faded but was still readable, was a rough sketch of the lighthouse grounds. It showed the tower, the keeper's house, and the rocky shoreline in surprising detail. But what made my hand shake was a notation written in the margin: "Treasure waits beneath the cliff where the storm cannot reach." And below that, in fresher ink like it had been added much later, "For Tim only. You'll know when you're ready." I must have read those lines 20 times, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. This had to be some kind of joke, right? Old men and their tall tales about buried treasure. But the handwriting was definitely Grandpa's, and something about the way it was hidden away made it feel real. The sketch showed details about the lighthouse property that I hadn't noticed before. There were markings indicating what looked like caves or indentations in the cliff face, accessible only at low tide. Numbers and measurements that meant nothing to me, but looked like they meant everything to him. Sitting there on that cold wooden floor, holding that journal in the fading afternoon light, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind of hope that keeps you buying lottery tickets, but something deeper. Like maybe Grandpa had known all along that I'd end up here, at this exact moment, needing something to believe in. The wind outside was picking up, making the lighthouse creak and settle like an old ship riding out a storm. I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks below, and for the first time since arriving, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about treasure maps and childhood adventures and the possibility that my crazy old grandfather had left me something more valuable than a crumbling lighthouse. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like the lighthouse itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. The journal entry was dated 3 weeks before Grandpa died. 3 weeks. Like he knew his time was running out and wanted to make sure the message got to me. The thought sent chills down my spine that had nothing to do with the Maine weather. As I finally drifted off to sleep in that narrow lighthouse bed, listening to the wind howl through the rafters, I couldn't help but smile at the cosmic joke of it all. Here I was, Tim Crow, the guy who couldn't keep a job or a girlfriend, suddenly sitting on what might be the biggest mystery of my life. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear Grandpa's voice again, carried on the salt wind. Real treasures hide where nobody thinks to look. Tomorrow, I decided I was going treasure hunting. I woke up the next morning with that journal burning a hole in my brain. You know that feeling when you've got something big brewing, but you're not sure if you're being smart or stupid. That was me, sitting at the tiny Lighthouse kitchen table with instant coffee that tasted like regret, staring at those faded pages like they held the secret to the universe. The journal wasn't just some old man's rambling diary. This thing read like a screenplay Steven Spielberg would kill for. Every page smelled like salt air and coffee grounds, with that distinctive old paper scent that takes you straight back to your childhood library visits. Grandpa had been methodical about his entries, dating each one with military precision. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, nothing like the shaky scrawl most people associate with old age. This was the work of someone who understood that details matter, that history has a way of slipping through the cracks if you don't nail it down with specifics. The entry that had me hooked was dated September 15th, 1944. Grandpa would have been just 15 years old, probably dreaming about baseball and girls like any other American teenager. Instead, he was about to witness something that would shape the rest of his life. According to his account, a massive storm had been battering the Maine coast for 3 days straight. The kind of weather that makes even seasoned fishermen tie up their boats and wait it out. Waves were running 20 feet high, winds gusting over 60 miles per hour, and visibility was basically zero. But that's when things got interesting. Through the storm, Grandpa and his father spotted distress flares coming from the direction of Devil's Teeth, a nasty cluster of rocks about half a mile offshore. Now, any sensible person would assume it was some poor fishing boat that got caught in the weather. Except this wasn't any ordinary vessel in trouble. What they found when the storm cleared was a wreckage of what Grandpa described as a sleek, black speedboat. Not the kind of craft you'd expect to see in those waters, especially not during wartime. This thing looked like it was built for speed and stealth, not hauling lobster traps. The boat had Canadian markings, but something about it felt off. Grandpa wrote that it reminded him of the rum runners his own grandfather used to tell stories about during Prohibition. Fast boats with hidden compartments, designed to outrun Coast Guard cutters. When they reached the wreck, they found one survivor, clinging to a piece of debris. The guy was barely conscious, speaking in what sounded like a mix of French and English. Canadian, maybe, but not your typical fisherman. This man was wearing expensive clothes under his life jacket, and his hands were too soft for someone who made his living on the water. Grandpa and his father managed to get the survivor back to shore, but it was clear the man wasn't going to make it. Hypothermia, internal injuries, and whatever else happens when you get thrown around in a hurricane force storm. But before he died, the stranger grabbed Grandpa's shirt and whispered something that would haunt him for the next 80 years. The dying man's exact words, according to the journal: "Hide it. They will come looking. The cargo is worth more than the conscience of this entire coastline." Then he pressed something into Grandpa's hand, a small, waterproof pouch containing what looked like official documents and a detailed map of the Lighthouse property. Not just any map, but one that showed hidden passages and storage areas that shouldn't have existed. Here's where the story gets really wild. Grandpa and his father went back to investigate the wreck more thoroughly once the weather calmed down. What they found in the boat's hidden compartments wasn't lobsters or fishing gear. According to the journal, it was cargo that made their eyes go wide and their hands shake. The exact details were written in some kind of code that I couldn't crack, but the implications were clear. This wasn't just smuggling. This was something big enough that people had died for it, and apparently worth enough that others would keep looking for it decades later. Grandpa's father, being a practical Maine man, made a decision that probably saved their lives. Instead of trying to claim salvage rights or report the find to authorities, they decided to hide everything and keep their mouths shut. In wartime, with U-boats prowling the Atlantic and everybody suspicious of everybody else, getting involved with mysterious Canadian smugglers seemed like a fast track to trouble. So they followed the dying man's map and found what he called Cache P-42, a hidden compartment built into the Lighthouse foundation during its original construction back in 1878. Apparently, Even the lighthouse builders had understood the value of discreet storage. Reading this, I couldn't help but laugh at myself. Here I was, sitting in my inherited lighthouse, taking this whole treasure map scenario seriously like some middle-aged kid playing pirates. But then again, what else did I have to lose? My career was dead, my love life was non-existent, and my family thought I was a joke anyway. Sometimes a treasure map is just life's way of reminding you that you're not ready for what you think you want. That was my own philosophy after my third cup of terrible instant coffee. Anyway. But here's the thing about Grandpa. He never lied. Not once in all the years I knew him. When he told you something, you could take it to the bank. So if he wrote in his journal that there was treasure hidden under this lighthouse, then there was treasure hidden under this lighthouse. The logical part of my brain kept trying to talk me out of it. Tim, you're a grown man. You don't believe in pirate treasure. This is probably just an old man's fantasies getting mixed up with his memories. But the desperate part of my brain, the part that had been unemployed for 6 months and was running out of options, kept whispering, what if it's real? So I did what any reasonable person would do in my situation. I started tapping on floorboards like I was auditioning for a role in an Indiana Jones movie. The lighthouse kitchen wasn't very big, maybe 12 feet across, so it didn't take long to work my way around the perimeter. Most of the boards sounded solid, giving off that dull thunk you'd expect from old hardwood over a stone foundation. But when I got to the area near the back wall, one section sounded different. Hollow, like there was empty space underneath. My heart started doing that thing where it feels like it's trying to escape through your throat. This was it. This was either the moment I discovered I'd inherited something amazing, or the moment I confirmed that I was losing my mind in a lighthouse in Maine. I found a butter knife in one of the kitchen drawers and started working at the edges of the suspicious floorboard. The wood was old but well-maintained, and it didn't take much effort to pry it up. What I found underneath made me sit down hard on the kitchen floor. There was definitely a hollow space under the floorboards, but it wasn't just an empty gap. Someone had built a proper access hatch, complete with hinges and a handle that had been painted over so many times it was almost invisible. The craftsmanship was professional, not some weekend DIY project. But what really got my attention was the inscription carved into the metal hatch cover. Only those who seek shall find. Biblical reference, maybe, or just old-fashioned New England philosophy. Either way, it felt significant. Like Grandpa had left me a message that went deeper than just directions to hidden treasure. I was so focused on the hatch that I almost missed the other details. Almost. But as I knelt there on the kitchen floor, running my fingers over carved inscription, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh scratches around the lock mechanism. Recent damage to the painted surface. And what looked like metal shavings scattered on the floor that definitely hadn't been there when I moved in 2 weeks ago. Someone else had been here, recently. Someone who knew about the hatch and had tried to get it open. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone in this treasure hunt. Somewhere out there, other people knew about Grandpa's secret, and they'd been inside my lighthouse, probably while I was sleeping upstairs, trying to get to whatever was hidden beneath my kitchen floor. Suddenly, the isolation that had felt peaceful a few days ago felt dangerous. The lighthouse that had seemed like a refuge now felt like a target, and I was standing right in the middle of it with no idea what I was dealing with. I spent the next hour going through the lighthouse room by room, looking for any other signs of intrusion. Nothing obvious. No broken locks, no missing items, no muddy footprints. But there were little things. A window that was open when I was sure I closed it. Books on a shelf that weren't quite in the same order. A coffee cup in the sink that I didn't remember using. Either I was becoming paranoid, or someone had been making themselves at home while I was out getting supplies in town. The smart thing would have been to call the police, report a break-in, let the professionals handle it. But what was I going to tell them? Officer, someone broke into my lighthouse to look for treasure that may or may not exist based on my dead grandfather's diary. Besides, I was curious now. More than curious, I was invested. This wasn't just about potential treasure anymore. This was about understanding why Grandpa had left me this lighthouse, this journal, and this mystery. It was about proving to myself that I could figure something out for once in my life. As evening settled over Black Point, I made a decision that probably wasn't the smartest thing I'd ever done. Instead of running away or calling for help, I decided to open that hatch and see what Grandpa had left for me. If there were other people looking for it, then it must be worth finding. I gathered up some tools from the Lighthouse maintenance shed, a proper crowbar, a flashlight that actually worked, and a hammer just in case. The hatch lock looked old but sturdy, and those fresh scratches suggested it had successfully resisted previous attempts to open it. Standing there in my kitchen as darkness fell outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to cross a line. Once I opened that hatch, there would be no going back to my simple life as a guy who inherited a lighthouse. Whatever was down there would change everything. But maybe that was exactly what I needed. Maybe change was a treasure I'd been looking for all along. The carved inscription seemed to glow in the flashlight beam. Only those who seek shall find. Time to find out what Grandpa had been seeking all these years. The lock on that hatch fought me like it had a personal vendetta. But eventually my crowbar won the argument. When the metal cover finally swung open, I was hit with a blast of air that smelled like old coins, machine oil, and 80 years of secrets. The beam of my flashlight disappeared into what looked like a narrow shaft leading straight down into the lighthouse foundation. This wasn't just some crawl space or storage area. Someone had carved out a proper chamber in the bedrock beneath the lighthouse, probably during the original construction. The walls were lined with cut stone, and I could see the bottom maybe 8 feet down. There was a ladder built into one wall, old but solid looking. Taking a deep breath that tasted like adventure and poor life choices, I started climbing down into what felt like the world's most expensive rabbit hole. The ladder rungs were slick with condensation, and every step down made me more aware that I was descending into a space where literally nobody would think to look for me if things went wrong. The chamber at the bottom was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 10 feet square with a ceiling just high enough that I could stand upright. The walls were covered in the same careful stonework as the rest of the lighthouse foundation, but this room had clearly been designed for concealment rather than functionality. And there, sitting in the center of the chamber like it was waiting for me specifically, was a wooden crate that looked like it had been built to survive the apocalypse. Heavy oak construction with metal corner brackets and a lock that belonged in a museum. The thing probably weighed as much as my Honda Civic, and just looking at it made my pulse start racing like I just chugged 3 Red Bulls. This was it. This was what that dying smuggler had whispered about. What Grandpa had hidden for over 80 years. What those mysterious intruders had been trying to find. Everything came down to whatever was inside this box. The lock was old-school heavy-duty, the kind they used to use on bank vaults before electronic security became a thing. But 80 years of Maine humidity had not been kind to metal, and my crowbar made short work of what time had already weakened. When the lid finally creaked open, I had to sit down hard on the stone floor. Inside that crate, nestled in what looked like custom-fitted compartments lined with oiled canvas, were metal bars that caught my flashlight beam and threw it back like liquid silver. These weren't gold bars like you see in heist movies. These were something else entirely. Each bar was about the size of a paperback book, but probably weighed 15 pounds. They had that distinctive gray-white sheen that I recognized from chemistry class back in high school. Platinum. Real honest-to-God platinum ingots. Each one stamped with markings that looked official and very, very old. I picked up one of the bars with hands that were shaking worse than a leaf in a hurricane. The metal was cold and dense, with weight that spoke of serious money. But it was the markings that really got my attention. Each ingot was wrapped in what looked like wax paper with numbers written in fading ink, like evidence tags in some long-forgotten criminal case. The stampings on the metal itself were even more interesting. Most of them had bank markings I didn't recognize, with dates going back to the 1940s. One set of ingots had German text that made my stomach drop. Another group had what looked like Swiss banking symbols, and a few bore the unmistakable seal of the Canadian Royal Bank. Sitting there in that hidden chamber, holding a fortune in precious metal while trying not to think about where it might have come from, I had what you might call a moment of clarity. Someone wise probably said that wealth isn't about what you hold in your hands, but what you have the courage to do with it. Though at that moment, I was mostly thinking about whether I was now a millionaire or about to become a federal fugitive. I counted 17 bars total, each one carefully wrapped and numbered like components in some elaborate accounting system. If these were real platinum ingots, and if the current market price was anywhere near what I remember from watching financial news during my unemployment, I was looking at enough money to buy a small town. But this wasn't just buried treasure in the fun, adventurous sense. This was a loss that someone had been searching for across multiple decades. And judging by those fresh scratches on the hatch lock upstairs, someone still was. The implications hit me like a freight train carrying a load of reality checks. This wasn't some romantic pirate treasure that I could claim and sail off into the sunset with. This was wartime contraband, probably stolen from people who had very good reasons for wanting it back. The kind of reasons that involved lawyers, federal investigations, and possibly much worse. I started examining the papers wrapped around each ingot more carefully. Most of the writing was in codes or languages I couldn't read, but some of it was in English. Bank transfer documents, shipping manifests, and what looked like insurance claims. All dated between 1943 and 1944. One document in particular made my blood run cold. It was a letter written in careful English, addressed to someone called S. Crow. That would be Samuel Crow, my grandfather. The letter was brief and to the point. The cargo must remain hidden until the situation stabilizes. Those who seek it will not give up easily. Trust no one with this information. It was signed with initials I couldn't make out, but the date was clear, October 15th, 1944. Just a month after that mysterious shipwreck Grandpa had written about in his journal. As I sat there in that underground chamber, surrounded by enough precious metal to change my life forever, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early unemployment days. Genuine fear. Not the anxiety kind of fear that comes with job interviews and overdue bills, but the primal kind that tells you you're in way over your head. This treasure came with a price tag that went far beyond whatever taxes I might owe on it. People had died for this. People were still looking for it. And now I was a guy sitting on top of it with no idea what I was dealing with. I was so absorbed in trying to process the magnitude of what I found that I almost missed the sound. Almost. But when you're sitting alone in an underground chamber in the middle of nowhere, holding stolen wartime treasure, your hearing tends to get pretty sharp pretty fast. Footsteps. Directly above me, someone was walking around in my Lighthouse kitchen. My heart started doing that thing where it tries to pound its way out of your chest and make a run for it. I killed my flashlight immediately and sat in complete darkness, listening to the unmistakable sound of someone moving around upstairs. Slow, careful footsteps that suggested they were trying not to be heard. The smart thing would have been to stay hidden, wait for whoever was to leave, then figure out my next move. But fear has a funny way of making you do stupid things, especially when you're sitting on a fortune in stolen treasure and starting to realize that your nice, quiet lighthouse might be about to become very noisy very fast. I could hear them moving around systematically, like they were searching for something specific. Drawers opening and closing, furniture being moved. They weren't trying to rob the place. They were looking for the same thing I had just found. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I waited in the darkness, barely breathing, straining to hear any indication of what was happening upstairs. Had they left? Were they waiting? Had they figured out where the hatch was? Then I heard the one sound I'd been dreading. The distinctive creak of the kitchen floorboard right above the secret entrance. They'd found it. They knew about the hatch. And I was trapped 8 feet underground with nowhere to run. That's when I noticed the envelope I'd somehow missed in my excitement over the platinum. It was tucked into a corner of the crate, sealed with wax that had somehow survived 8 decades underground. The paper felt expensive, the kind they used for important documents back when people still wrote letters by hand. My name was written on the outside in Grandpa's careful script. For Tim, when you find what you're looking for. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made my hands shake worse than they already were. Tim, choose carefully, wealth or peace. One will take the other. What you do next will define who you become. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before Grandpa died. 3 weeks. He'd known I would end up here, in this chamber, holding this treasure, facing this choice. Somehow, he'd seen it all coming. But what really got my attention was a postscript at the bottom of the page. If you're reading this, you're not alone. They never stop looking. Trust your instincts, not your greed. As if on cue, I heard the unmistakable sound of the hatch cover being moved above me. Someone was opening the entrance to my hiding place. Someone who clearly knew exactly where it was and how to get to it. I stuffed Grandpa's letter into my pocket and tried to think fast. I had maybe 30 seconds before whoever was upstairs figured out how to get down here. The platinum was too heavy to move quickly, and there was nowhere in the chamber to hide. I was about to come face to face with people who had been searching for this treasure longer than I had been alive. The beam of a powerful flashlight suddenly cut through the darkness above me, and I heard the first rung of the ladder creak under someone's weight. Game over. Time to find out who else knew about Cash P-42. In that moment, sitting in an underground chamber beneath a lighthouse in Maine, surrounded by wartime treasure and trapped by mysterious intruders, I finally understood what Grandpa had been trying to tell me all along. Real treasures hide where nobody thinks to look. But sometimes when you find them, you discover that you're not the only one who's been looking. The footsteps on the ladder were getting closer. Time to see if I was about to become rich, or if I was about to become a very interesting news story about a man who disappeared from a lighthouse on the Maine coast. Funny how life works out sometimes. 6 months ago, I was worried about making rent. Now I was sitting on a fortune and wondering if I'd live long enough to spend it. The flashlight beam was getting brighter. Almost time to meet my uninvited guests. The flashlight beam hit me like a spotlight at a police interrogation, and I braced myself to meet whoever had been hunting this treasure for the past 80 years. My heart was doing its best impression of jackhammer when I heard a familiar voice called down from above. Except it wasn't the voice I wanted to hear. It was my brother Kevin, and from the tone of his voice, he wasn't particularly surprised to find a secret entrance in my lighthouse kitchen. Kevin climbed down that ladder like he owned the place, which immediately told me this wasn't his first visit to my property. The smug expression on his face when his flashlight illuminated me sitting next to a crate full of platinum bars was exactly what I'd expect from the golden child who'd been convinced his whole life that he deserved everything good that came to our family. Kevin was 3 years older than me and had never let me forget it. Even at 41, he still had that entitled swagger that came from being a successful brother, the one who built the family landscaping business into something profitable while I bounced between marketing jobs and unemployment lines. But what really got under my skin was how unsurprised he looked to find me sitting next to what was obviously a fortune in precious metal. Like he'd been expecting this moment for years, just waiting for the right opportunity to claim what he thought should be his. The conversation that followed in that underground chamber was like every argument we'd ever had as kids, except this time we were surrounded by millions of dollars worth of wartime contraband. Kevin informed me that he'd suspected Grandpa was hiding something valuable ever since we were teenagers. All those weekend trips to the Lighthouse, all those stories about buried treasure and wartime adventures. Kevin had always figured there was something real behind the old man's tales. When Grandpa died and left the lighthouse specifically to me, Kevin knew something was up. He'd been keeping an eye on the property, making regular visits to see what I might discover. When he noticed fresh activity around the lighthouse and saw the open hatch in my kitchen floor tonight, he decided it was time to claim his share of the family inheritance. Kevin's argument was simple. Anything found on family property should be split equally among family members, regardless of what some outdated will said. As far as he was concerned, Grandpa had been playing favorites, and it was time to correct that injustice. He'd already contacted his own lawyer and done preliminary research on maritime salvage laws. I told Kevin in no uncertain terms that he could take his legal theories and his sense of entitlement and get off my property. The lighthouse was mine, the treasure was mine, and if he wanted to fight about it, he could do it through proper legal channels instead of breaking into my house in the middle of the night. But Kevin wasn't backing down. He pointed out that I'd always been a family failure, the one who couldn't hold a job or maintain a relationship, while he'd been building something real with a landscaping business. Why should the irresponsible brother get rewarded with millions of dollars just because Grandpa had played favorites in his dotage? The argument escalated quickly in that cramped underground space, with both of us saying things we probably shouldn't have. Kevin accused me of manipulating Grandpa in his final years, convincing him to change his will to benefit me. I accused Kevin of being a greedy opportunist who couldn't stand the thought of me succeeding at anything. What made the whole situation worse was that Kevin had clearly been planning this confrontation for weeks. He knew about the possibility of hidden treasure. He'd researched the legal implications of family discoveries, and he was prepared to fight for what he believed was rightfully his portion of Grandpa's legacy. Eventually, we reached the kind of stalemate that only happens between family members who know exactly how to hurt each other. Kevin made it clear that he wasn't going away quietly. If I wanted to keep the treasure, I was going to have to prove in court that I deserved it more than he did. I told him to bring it on. After years of being treated like the family disappointment, I was ready to fight for something that was legally and rightfully mine. If Kevin wanted a war over Grandpa's inheritance, he could have one. The confrontation ended with Kevin climbing back up the ladder, leaving me alone in the chamber with my treasure and a whole new set of problems. It was one thing to worry about mysterious strangers who might be looking for wartime contraband. It was something else entirely to have your own brother plotting against you. I spent the rest of that night documenting everything in the crate, taking photos and making detailed notes. If Kevin was planning a legal challenge, I wanted to be ready with evidence that I'd been the one to discover the treasure and that it had been specifically intended for me according to Grandpa's journal. The next morning, I contacted the one person I knew who might be able to help me navigate this legal nightmare. Robert Thorne, the lawyer Grandpa had mentioned in his journal. Turns out, Grandpa had been planning for this moment a lot longer than I'd realized. Robert Thorne was exactly the kind of attorney you'd want in your corner when your family was trying to steal your inheritance. The guy specialized in maritime law, historical recovery cases, and family disputes involving valuable discoveries. He'd been waiting for my call for almost 2 years, ever since Grandpa had first contacted him about potential legal challenges to his will. His research over the following weeks revealed that the platinum was indeed part of a lost shipment that had been written off by insurance companies in 1944. The original owners were either dead or had been compensated decades ago. More importantly, the statute of limitations on any criminal charges had expired sometime during the Reagan administration. The process was like watching the world's most expensive soap opera unfold in real time. Weeks of document review, historical verification, and legal filings that made my college textbooks look like light reading. But slowly, piece by piece, we built an airtight case of my ownership of the treasure. The final appraisal came back at $5.2 million. After taxes, legal fees, and various administrative costs, I was looking at roughly $3.8 million in actual money. Not enough to buy a private island, but definitely enough to never worry about rent again. True to his word, Kevin made good on his threats. 3 days after our confrontation in the treasure chamber, I received official legal documents challenging Grandpa's will and demanding that any discoveries on the Lighthouse property be considered part of the general family estate. Kevin's lawyers argued that Grandpa's treasure hunt stories had been signs of developing dementia rather than legitimate historical accounts. They painted me as someone who had taken advantage of an elderly man's confusion to manipulate his final wishes and steal what should rightfully belong to all of Samuel Crow's descendants. The court case was like something out of Netflix legal drama, except with worse coffee and more uncomfortable chairs. Kevin's legal team argued that Grandpa's mental competency had been questionable in his final years, and that his decision to leave everything to me had been the result of undue influence rather than sound judgment. My legal team countered with Grandpa's detailed journals, his correspondence with various historical societies, and testimony from medical professionals who had examined him right up until his death. We had documentation going back decades showing that Grandpa had been completely lucid and intentional about his arrangements. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who clearly had better things to do than referee family disputes over treasure maps. But she took the historical aspect seriously, bringing in expert witnesses to verify the authenticity of the platinum and the legitimacy of the salvage claim. Life is what happens when you find treasure, but you're afraid it might consume you instead of free you. That was my philosophy after 3 sleepless nights of worrying about whether my own brother was going to successfully steal my inheritance through legal manipulation. After 2 months of legal proceedings that cost me about $200,000 in attorney fees, the court ruled in my favor. Grandpa's was crystal clear. The lighthouse and everything in it belonged to me. Kevin's claims were dismissed, and I was officially declared the legal owner of $5.2 million worth of wartime platinum. Standing on those courthouse steps after the final ruling, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Vindication. Not just financial security, but proof that I was capable of handling something important. That maybe I wasn't the family failure everyone had always assumed I was. But here's the thing about winning against family. It changes everything, and not always in good ways. Kevin barely spoke to me after the court case. Other family members started treating me differently, like I was either incredibly lucky or possibly dangerous. The dynamics of every relationship in my life shifted overnight. Success can be just as isolating as failure, especially when it comes to the kind of history that my particular treasure carried. The money was real, the legal victory was complete, but the emotional cost was something I hadn't anticipated. I decided to keep living in the lighthouse, at least for a while, partly because I'd grown attached to the place, but mostly because I wanted to understand what Grandpa had really intended when he left me this inheritance. The treasure was just the beginning of something bigger. I used some of the money to completely restore the lighthouse, bringing it up to modern standards while preserving its historical character. New roof, proper insulation, reliable electricity, and yes, finally got decent internet installed. The place went from being a drafty monument to maritime history, to being a comfortable home with an amazing view. I also donated a significant portion to the main maritime museum, specifically for programs that preserve the stories of World War II coastal operations. If this treasure had taught me anything, it was that history has a way of hiding in plain sight until someone cares enough to look for it. The legal battles were over, the money was safely in the bank, and I was finally starting to feel like I might actually deserve the good fortune that had fallen into my lap. I'd gone from unemployed loser to millionaire lighthouse owner in less than 6 months, and somehow I'd managed not to screw it up. But just when I thought the adventure was over, I discovered that some stories don't end when you think they do. 3 days after the final court ruling, I found an envelope slipped under my lighthouse door sometime during the night. Plain white paper, no postmark, no return address. Just my name written in block letters that looked like someone had been trying to disguise their handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made my blood run cold. You took what belonged to them. They will come for what is theirs. The note wasn't signed, but there was something about it that felt different from the usual crank mail that comes with any public legal case. This felt personal, like whoever wrote it knew more about the treasure's history than had come out in court. That night, lying in my newly comfortable lighthouse bed, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if claiming the treasure had been the end of my problems or just the beginning of new ones. The money was real. The legal victory was complete, but apparently the story wasn't over. Sometimes winning is just the start of a different kind of challenge. And sometimes when you find treasure, you discover that other people have been looking for it longer than you've been alive, and they're not necessarily happy that you found it first. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark water outside my window, just like it had for over a century. But for the first time since moving in, I found myself wondering who might be out there in that darkness, watching and waiting for their chance to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. I was rich, I was legally vindicated, and I was finally living somewhere I could call home. But I was also starting to understand that some treasures come with prices that can't be calculated in dollars and cents. The note sat on my kitchen table, like a promise of complications to come. That threatening note turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me. Instead of running scared, I decided to stay put and see what happened next. Sometimes you turn on a light not to guide others, but to keep yourself from getting lost in the darkness of your own fears. The first few weeks I was jumpy. Every sound outside made me think someone was coming to steal what I'd legally won. Every unfamiliar car on the coastal road made me wonder if those mysterious people who'd been searching for treasure had finally tracked me down. But nothing happened. Days turned into weeks, and gradually I realized that whoever had left that note was probably more bark than bite. Maybe it was just Kevin trying to mess with my head after losing in court. Either way, I stopped looking over my shoulder and started focusing on what I actually wanted to do with my new life. The lighthouse restoration became my obsession. I spent months learning about maritime preservation, slowly bringing the place back to its original glory while adding modern conveniences. I kept the original spiral staircase, but added safety railings. The lamp room got LED lights that could be seen for miles. Every evening at sunset, I started a tradition that probably seems weird but made perfect sense to me. I'd climb up to the lamp room and turn on the lighthouse beacon for exactly 1 hour. Not because ships needed guidance in these GPS waters, but because the light reminded me of Grandpa and all his stories about being a guardian of the coast. 6 months after the court case, I received a letter from the Maine Maritime Museum. I kept 1 platinum bar as a keepsake, call it sentiment or insurance, but something told me not to sell everything at once. The museum wanted to examine my remaining bar for possible historical significance. When their expert took a closer look, we discovered something incredible. This bar had markings from the Hamburg Fund, which had been lost during a submarine attack in 1943. This wasn't just wartime contraband. This bar was part of a fund established to help Jewish refugees escape Nazi Germany. The museum estimated the single bar was worth $1.8 million, not just for platinum, but for its historical significance. They wanted it for an exhibit about wartime rescue operations, but they needed my permission as the legal owner. I didn't hesitate. That bar belonged to the museum, not my bank account. But instead of just donating it, I worked out something better. The museum would sell it to a collector who specialized in World War II artifacts, and the money would establish the Samuel Crowe Veterans Foundation. Grandpa would have loved that. All his life, he'd talked about wanting to do something meaningful for veterans who didn't make a home. Now, 80 years later, his hidden treasure was finally serving that purpose. The foundation became my new obsession. We provided emergency financial assistance to veterans' families, funded job training programs, and sponsored educational programs about World War II history in Maine schools. Within a year, we'd helped over 200 families and funded 3 new exhibits at historical sites along the coast. Running a nonprofit introduced me to people I never would have met otherwise. Veterans who shared stories about their service, historians passionate about preserving coastal Maine's wartime heritage, and volunteers who just want to help because it was the right thing to do. I even started dating again. Her name was Sarah, different Sarah than my ex, and she was a marine biologist who worked at the research station down the coast. She thought my lighthouse keeper lifestyle was either incredibly romantic or slightly unhinged, but she was willing to find out which. 6 months into our relationship, Sarah made an observation that changed how I thought about my inheritance. She pointed out that I'd never actually spent any of the treasure money on myself, beyond the lighthouse restoration. Everything else, the foundation, museum donations, preservation projects, I'd been giving all away. When she asked why, I realized I'd been unconsciously following Grandpa's example. He'd hidden that treasure for 80 years, not because he wanted to get rich, but because he understood that some things are more valuable when you share them than when you hoard them. That's when I started the Lighthouse tours. Every Saturday morning, I'd open up the property to visitors who wanted to learn about Maine's maritime history and the role lighthouses played during World War II. I'd tell them about Grandpa's stories, the mysterious shipwreck, and how sometimes the most important treasures are the ones you find when you're not really looking. The tours became popular enough that I had to start charging admission, but all the money went straight to the Veterans Foundation. People love the combination of local history, treasure hunting adventure, and feel-good charity work. These days, I wake up every morning in a lighthouse that's been restored to its former glory, overlooking an ocean that reminds me daily how small my problems really are. I run a foundation that's made a real difference in people's lives. I'm dating someone who makes me laugh, and I finally found work that feels like it matters. Kevin and I still don't talk much, but I heard through family channels that his landscaping business is doing well. Maybe someday we'll figure out how to be brothers again. Or maybe some bridges are meant to stay burned. Either way, I'm not losing sleep over it. Every evening at sunset, I still climb those spiral stairs and turn on the lighthouse beacon for exactly 1 hour. Not because ships need guidance, but because lighting that beacon reminds me that sometimes your job isn't to chase treasure, but to be a beacon for other people who might be lost in the dark. The real treasure was never the platinum. It was learning that when you find something valuable, the best thing you can do is share it with people who need it more than you do. Grandpa knew that all along. It just took me 38 years to figure it out. And sometimes when the fog rolls in heavy off the Atlantic and the lighthouse beam cuts through the darkness, I can almost hear Grandpa's voice carried on the salt wind, reminding me that real treasures hide where nobody thinks to look. Turns out, the best place to hide a treasure is in plain sight, where it can do the most good for the most people. Who knew that the family failure would end up being the one who finally understood what the old man was trying to teach us all along?